And we are live with Ian Rowe. You all may recognize Ian because he was on a previous show with us. So he needs no introduction, but we will, for those of you who weren't watching that day, Ian has recently ended a decade-long tenure as CEO of public prep charter schools in New York. He is also a resident fellow.
Now led by the amazing Janelle Bradshaw.
He is also a resident fellow at American Enterprise Institute, entrepreneur in residence at the Charter School Growth Fund, and the author of a forthcoming book that will be out next year through Templeton Press entitled Agency, which is really the reason for him to join us today so that we can talk about agency. One last kind of marker to throw in there. Ian is also starting a new set of charter schools, charter high schools, that are going to bring international baccalaureate programs to a wider audience, to kids that don't normally get it. And he's doing that through Vertex Partnership Academies. Yes. Ian, thank you for joining us.
Chris, thanks for having me on.
So you wrote this article that the Wall Street Journal, it's an op-ed, the Wall Street Journal titled it The Power of Personal Agency. You titled it something different, a little bit longer than that, but that was their reduction of what your message is. I want to start at the beginning because in this article, and I'm sure this is going to be challenging for some people, you say the narrative that white people hold the power conveys a wrong-headed notion of white superiority and creates an illusion of black dependency on white largesse. This false assignment of responsibility, while coming from an authentic desire to produce change, can create a new kind of mental enslavement. That's a challenging statement. Tell me more about this, Ian.
Well, first of all, Chris, thank you for having me on. As always, it's really important that we can model productive dialogue around these issues. And as you said, for the last 10 years, I've run Public Prep, which is a network of single-gender public charter schools, 2,000 kids in the heart of the South Bronx and Lower East Side of Manhattan. And one of the things that we have prided ourselves on, and Vertex will be the same, is that our kids are going to face structural barriers in their life based on race, gender, you name it. They exist. And many of us are fighting hard to dismantle those barriers, right? Mm-hmm. But the thing is, we need to ensure young people understand the power that they do have within their own, within their own ability, like the factors that they control. And so what I was starting to feel, the narrative that was developing, it's essentially that white people have to renounce their privilege first before Black people can advance. And for me, what was missing from the whole dialogue is the whole idea of Black excellence, of the power of individual agency. The fact that, yes, there are these horrific events like what happened to George Floyd, which was a killing and a murder, and this person should be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. In 2018, there were 23 Black people killed, unarmed Black people killed by police. But that same year, there were also 3 million Black kids in college or graduate school in 2018. So it's 23 too many, and we need to go after all of the instances of which police brutality is happening. But we also can't lose sight of the fact that there are millions of Black kids figuring out a path forward. What can we learn from that? And so I felt it was powerful, it was necessary to write some words that indicated this new kind of mental enslavement is that we don't want white people to think that they hold all the power and that Black people are the ones that are dependent solely on white people to advance our interests.
Mm. Do you think it's really a narrative, though? You write the narrative that white people hold the power. So when you look at the number of Black governors, the number of Black senators, the number of Black people who lead commerce, banking, industry, education, all levels of economic and life activity in the United States, Black people aren't capitalized the way that they should be. Now we can say, we can argue about the reasons for why they're not capitalized the way they are. But if we are just really talking about an honest assessment of power, is it really wrongheaded that white people have the market cornered in most areas of life activity in the United States?
Well, Chris, let me ask you, who holds power over your life?
God.
Okay. All right. So that's important. Is
Yeah.
there a second? So that's a very important statement right there.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So who else holds power over your life?
Jesus Christ.
Okay. All right. So this is an interesting hierarchy.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
Yeah. The Holy Spirit.
Okay. God, the Holy Spirit. Okay.
Got three there.
Any earthbound individuals?
Brother, I would argue that those are all earthbound. I mean, they're all
Okay.
here. Okay. They're material
By
here.
the way, I'm not disagreeing, because I think
Okay.
we don't often recognize even what you're saying when we talk about power. That there is a higher power. But the reason I'm pushing you to say that is, in addition to those very powerful mentions that you just made, you have power over your own life, right? So yes, there are white governors or black governors, there's mayors, there are lots of people of different races, quote unquote, in power. The thing that I always try to come back to with our kids is, what is the power that you have within your own life first? It doesn't mean that you're going to encounter power structures that may be hostile to your interests. What matters is how you respond to it, right? Because the moment that we have kids think that someone else is in power of your own ability to advance your life, then that's a mental enslavement that we have to fight hard to ensure our kids don't develop, especially in our schools. Our kids are already surrounded by many people telling them all the things that they will not be able to do because of their race. Where is it that they're hearing what they can do because of who they are? And my general point is, there are millions of examples of young Black kids who are doing the right thing. Now, that doesn't mean that those kids doing the right thing won't also be someday susceptible to discrimination based on race. And that's why we got to fight that too. But it is a shared responsibility. And that's the point
So,
we got to keep focusing on.
Let me challenge this just a little bit by using somewhat of a crude example, but it is a fitting for me example. So I have all boys, and then I have one daughter. I love all my children. I don't love them equally. I love them all, and I love them all adequately.
Broadcast, you know.
So, yeah, I know. It's not, well, I don't think it's, I love them adequately, which to me means if I love them equally, that would be doing them a disservice, because they have different, I think, kind of needs and stuff, whatever. But a daughter, my last child is a daughter, and it was the first time I did encounter a different set of parental priorities and thinking through how I'm going to form a fully grown person. Right. How I'm going to help her get to her best self.
Yep.
And there are all these things that I'm afraid of in the world for her, because she's a girl and she's going to be a woman. And the statistics are real about what happens to girls, young women, when they enter college campuses, for instance, when they walk alone in dark parts of a city at night, when they, many dangerous situations. Am I holding her back by teaching her the realities of those dangers and the power that people have? Can't I do that and teach her personal agency at the same time?
No. Yes. This is a key part of the message. It's not that you would be a bad parent if you didn't tell your daughter, hey, here's some things that have happened on campus. These are real. And here are the strategies you should deploy to make sure you decrease the probability that those things will happen to you. To me, that is exactly the point I'm making. You know, so I talk a lot about the success sequence, right? So the fact
tell people what that is.
Right. So it's a piece of research. It was done by the Brookings Institution several years ago, and then has been reaffirmed in lots of different research studies. And it's almost common sense. But for people who have finished just a high school degree, then gotten a full-time job of any kind, just so they learn the dignity and discipline of work, marriage, then children, in that order, 97% of the people who have done that, the data shows that they have avoided poverty, right? Now, that's not a guarantee though, but if we have our kids think in terms of probabilities, then that's a set of decisions that our kids need to know, that they will decrease the likelihood that they will face adverse circumstances, but there is no guarantee. The question is, are we equipping our kids with the information that's going to give them the best shot to be successful? And that's why I feel like this is such an important message to be out there.
Do you feel that someone realistically is teaching children the opposite? Is there really anywhere in the United States where Black people, Black parents, others, friends, family member are teaching Black children that you can't do everything that you want? I mean, I grew up in a, upper poor, maybe middle working class set of circumstances. And the messages I heard constantly all around were, once you get an education, no one can take it away from you. And if you're going to be a janitor, be the best janitor you can be. Like, no matter what station in life you have, make sure you're the best one. I also heard things like, somebody else starts a fight with you, finish it. But there are these kind of what I call Negro proverbs that to me are more on the positive side. There are things that we have said even in the lowest levels of economic status within our communities. We've had these proverbs that have been passed down that to me sound fairly positive. So where is it that you're picking up the teaching of kids that their agency doesn't matter?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. I agree with you. I think probably in most Black households, the message is do the things like I just described. Finish your education, get a job, and if you have kids, make sure you're married first. I think that is probably more norm than not. The numbers, though, tell a different story. And by the way, this isn't just in the Black community, because I do a lot of research of births to women 24 and under, right? And across the country, 70% of those women 24 and under having babies are outside of marriage, right? So it's 61% in the white community, which is the highest rate of growth, right? So and the largest number of non-marital births are in the white community, but it's 90% in the Black community, right? And so the likelihood, not guaranteed, but the likelihood that those kids born to very young women outside of marriage, they're going to live in a life of poverty. That's just the data, right? So when you ask,
wait a second now, though.
Hold on.
The majority of them come from poverty, right?
What's that?
Is it the majority of them who do that are already in poverty, aren't they?
Right. So let's try to break the cycle.
Okay.
Right? So the whole idea is, how do you make sure that doesn't continue to happen? Like, we're on this generational treadmill of poverty, right? But sometimes when you say these, so this is an answer to your question of where are you hearing that people are, advocating to strip young people away from agency. One of the things I try to say is, look, we have to have the moral courage to say that it's important that every institution, family, faith, schools, is reinforcing this message that there's certain series of decisions that give you a greater likelihood of success than others. The success sequence is just one of those pathways. And so, but there are people who get upset if you say those things, because they might take that to mean, well, somehow you're blaming, I think we talked about this last time, you're blaming, someone for the situation they're in because of their life choices. And what I'm trying to say is, we're educators. We have kids in our schools who haven't yet made decisions about their lives, right? So what is it that we're teaching them about their ability to control their own destiny? And there are certain decisions that you can make that will give you greater control of your life than others. In my view, we'd be irresponsible not to tell that to kids.
Yeah. So, and I agree with you on much of this. So as we talk about this, just know that I'm pulling apart strings of this and just talking about it. But you and I have talked about this previously, about structural problems, things that are in the structure of the system that you can't just ignore. We can't happy talk them away. So you are a Black kid who is doing everything that you're supposed to be doing. You are going to school. You are seeing in your sights that you want to be a mathematician one day, or a scientist or something important, and you really believe it can happen because you saw somebody do it and whatever, but you're not there yet. You're poor, you have a single mom, blah blah blah, and you're on your way to school, and you become one of the people in the net of stop and frisk. At the moment of that interaction that you are being caught up in stop and frisk, that is not because you don't believe in yourself.
I agree.
That is not because you don't believe in your so now you compound that by multiple situations like that, where you begin to learn that your teachers don't really believe in you. Your teachers actually, and kids aren't stupid. They know when adults don't believe in them or when adults fancy talk them. So you realize that the system is rigged in some important ways. You see teachers all day long, some who are checked out, some who believe in you, some who don't, but you're smart enough as a kid to figure out what things are. You look at your surroundings, and maybe you get on a bus or you get on a train and go from your dilapidated school to some chess competition at a suburban school or somewhere, and you see what the other kids are getting. You also start saying to yourself, okay, see, that has nothing to do with my agency. That's just the way the world is structured. So someone comes along and says, yeah, but don't pay attention to that. Just think about all the probabilities in the world. That let's teach you about the probabilities that you have to make your life better. That kid is going to be saying, I already know like that I can do something. I'm just observing that stop and frisk. Teachers who congregate in my schools who don't believe in us and don't really have the skills to teach us, to be very honest with you. The lack of resources, or the you know.
No, I hear you, man.
You hear what I'm pointing out? So I'm pointing out a kid could be doing everything right, and they would be making honest observations about the world that do tell them for sure that things are not level.
Yeah. No, Chris, I mean, this is why it's so important we have these discussions, and they're extended conversations so we can talk about nuance. From someone like me, a Black person who has faced discrimination, who's run schools in the heart of the hood for a decade, those barriers are real, right? So we're never saying just ignore them, happy talk, everything's just great, just finish college, everything will be fine. Right?
No, work hard, be nice.
Or
that's not what you're saying.
Nice, everything.
That's not what you're saying. Okay.
but the truth is, it's almost because you're acknowledging those realities, you're acknowledging that these barriers exist, that makes it even more critical that you work hard. Right? Life is not a guarantee, even if you do all the right things, even outside of race, by the way, right? Like, life is not a guarantee. The whole point is knowing that it's not as if these barriers are just going to like dissolve tomorrow. Like, what do our kids do in the meantime? It's like, okay, sorry, and what do adults do? So I run charter schools. So my action was to say, when I look in the heart of the South Bronx, this particular district our boys' school is in, only 2% of boys that start 9th grade 4 years later graduate from high school ready for college.
2%.
2%, meaning that they either 4 years later, they dropped out of high school, or they actually did graduate, but they still can't do math or reading at a level where they can enter college without needing remediation. I don't know which is worse, that they dropped out or they actually did the work and they still can't do college level work. So we could either say that's a structural barrier, that's proof of the systemic racism that exists. So we got to wait for white people, we got to wait for some policy change to fix that, right? Well, I say, okay, let's do that. Let's work on that policy. And let's also start a charter school that has as its core assumption that hard work, character, diligence, resiliency, persistence, behavior like those associated with the success sequence, that those things matter as well. It's a shared responsibility. Basically, we don't sit on our ass while we're waiting. And I know we're protesting, we're doing all these things, which are great, but like work hard, be nice. It is interesting that Kip has abandoned that slogan on the premise somehow that I think, the premise that work hard, be nice indicates that if you work hard, be nice, everything's hunky-dory. There has never been a guarantee, right? Like even the success sequence, 97% of the time, people who've done that avoid poverty. It's not 100%. There are people who do all the right things and it still doesn't work. So but in the minds of kids, you don't create the image that therefore it's pointless.
That's what I'm challenging though with you, Ian, is I'm wondering who is telling children that it's pointless.
Well, the work hard, be nice change until, meritocracy is an illusion. Right. So until Kip comes back with whatever their new statement is, and I saw a letter that they wrote to the Wall Street Journal saying, no, 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 hard work matters, right? So my hope is that the second message is coming from Kip repudiates the first, because
well, wait a second now. Let's stick with this for a second. When you say that you agree that the system isn't level, so we need to teach kids to do all that they can, just to, no matter what, like no matter what world you're in, you have to do all that you can. Like if you follow the success sequence or whatnot, like you and I used an umbrella analogy. It's gonna rain. So instead of cursing the water, get an umbrella, right? Like,
instead of cursing the water, get an umbrella.
Get an umbrella. Go ahead.
By the way, it's not only up to it, so it's up to kids to exercise their individual agency, and it's up to the mediating institutions that form kids' mindsets. So family, faith, schools, the local community, the general media. What are the messages that those mediating institutions are doing to help shape the mindsets of young people? So another example, Nicole Hannah-Jones did a long 8,000 word piece in the New York Times Magazine.
Don't get me started, but go ahead.
But it's important for us all to have a dialogue on these things, right? 8,000 words of the tyrannical history of the United States, and how essentially she has these words in it that says that there is nothing a Black person can do to close the racial gap. Nothing. It doesn't matter if you get yourself educated, doesn't matter if you buy a house, doesn't matter if you save, there is nothing you can do. Right?
To close the racial wealth gap. Is that what you're saying?
Right.
The wealth gap, yeah, to be clear.
I just said there's nothing a Black person can unilaterally do to close 400 years of the racial wealth gap. Like, okay, but I'm not asking my 12-year-old in my school to close the racial wealth gap. I'm ensuring that they understand what they can do to have wealth in their life, wealth in terms of money, happiness, all of those things. So when you hear messages that there is nothing, there's nothing you can do, that's a message of powerlessness. It doesn't mean that there aren't structural things that we can do to change fiscal policy in this country. But the more that we keep sending to young people a message that, these barriers are so high, what's the point? So it may never be said explicitly in the way that I'm talking about it, but that is the impression that I believe many young people can get unless we are as explicit about the power that they do have.
So I think, I'm so conflicted when you and I talk about these things, because I agree with you on the one hand that the best way to get the revolution that we want, the best way to prepare kids for the world, to uplift the race, to change the game, is for Black people to become formally educated, get the right markers and credentials and passes that get you through gates, so that you can get so you can get into the American economic mainstream. And then once you have capital and you are capitalized, you have commensurate power in the way that the Irish did and the Italians did and others. Right. It's capital that actually, so you and I are never going to disagree on that as a pathway.
Right. And importantly, millions of Black people have done what you just said.
They've done it. They keep doing it. We can't talk about our own people as if this isn't already happening. So that part I'm not challenging so much. What I'm challenging is the need to think of that as somehow mixed with our analysis of the system itself. And if we don't have a critique for all the ways in which the system is not working for us right now, and actually works against us in ways that are not fair and are unfair. I mean, listen, when you have a place like Wisconsin that shuts down polling centers where you can vote in the blackest part of the entire state from 270 to 5. That is not something that's happening because the Black community doesn't have agency, and there is a material consequence to that. Yep. So someone in the power system is making a decision that they're going to make it harder for you to exercise the most fundamental right that you have in the United States. That is not because our young people don't believe in themselves, or because people are getting pregnant too soon, or because people don't want to work. That is happening because within the system, there is an embedded and inherent, long-standing white supremacist framework. right? Now, I'm not
Yep.
sure you're going to agree with that, but I am telling you, like, it's going to be hard for any
I'm not disagreeing with that.
any person in Milwaukee, like any community leader in Milwaukee, is going to be like, we could do both. We can teach our kids that they better work hard, because this world is not going to be fair. My grandfather, like, was very clear with me. My grandfather was like, you eat what you kill. That's the way this world works. Bottom line. That was my grandfather's thing. Like, he never waited for anybody, for anything. There's nothing that broke in his house that he couldn't fix. Right. He never needed a plumber, an electrician, an auto mechanic, a boating mechanic. He never needed any of that. Right. That was his life. So that's what I learned from my grandfather. Right. That's but he was also clear about the fact that he laid railroad tracks from Louisiana through St. Louis and other places, and he was getting paid 75 cents a day, where the white guys right next to him were getting paid $1.50, which meant that he was sending money home and they were sending money home, and they were capitalizing their families different for doing the same job. So he didn't tell that to me in a way where he was woe is me. He just told me that in a way of, that's why I had to work twice as hard, and that's why
both things are true, dude. I'm with you. That we got to fight that voting structure. So both things are true. There is a power dynamic. There are certain structures that are in place we must fight in the same time as we are empowering young people to know what they've got the power to do. My fear of this moment right now, and I think you even wrote about it in your recent paper, is this. There's a lot of what I call performative empathy, right? There's a lot of, more, black squares have been placed on Instagram pages, right? Or, Aunt Jemima is no longer sold on, right?
Stop.
But this is a serious thing, because that's not creating opportunity for young black kids. So in that same neighborhood I just talked about, only 2% of black boys 4 years later graduate from high school ready for college. Today, if you had an idea for a great school, a great charter school that you wanted to open to create more opportunity, I mean, our wait list right now has close to, our public preps wait list now has close to 5,000 kids on it, right? 5,000 families in the heart of the South Bronx. But today, if you wanted to start a great charter school in that community to educate boys, you are banned from doing that. There is a cap, right? That's a policy. That is a structural barrier. So when we're talking about the moves we got to make, let's just make sure the change that we're seeking actually is going to result in the advancement of people to our people, as opposed to a lot of feel-good stuff that has nothing to do with the advancement of black people, and it only has to do with making other people feel good that they're doing something, right? To me, that you used a phrase in your piece called faux-aggressives, right? That's a real thing. So at the end of the day, while we all need white allies, right? Black people also need to know that we can't depend on that solely for our advancement. It is a shared responsibility. So let's just be real about the changes that we're actually advocating for. And I'm giving you a specific example of a policy that's a structural barrier that right now, if I want to create opportunity for more kids in the heart of the South Bronx, I would be banned from doing that. But I don't hear organizations like Black Lives Matter talking about that. Right. And that's why we need to have these conversations and talk about what's the real change we need to advance opportunity for our kids.
That's what makes us a little bit suspicious for me, though, too, Ian, when I think about conservatives, because I have critique for put it out there. As a libertarian, I have critiques for the left and the right. Because all I want to be is free. And I think both sides actually want to stop me from being free in one way, shape, or form. And I can enumerate them on both sides. But what makes it challenging for me is we could have this entire discussion without it ever being about Al Sharpton, George Floyd, BLM, protests, or any of those things. We could take all those things entirely off of the table that Black people are engaging in, are participating in, or think are important, and we could talk just about the heart of what your theory is, the heart of what you want to discuss, which is agency. And agency to me is something that we could discuss that in its entirety without making it somehow a hammer against the things that we don't like that Black people are doing.
Yep.
And that leads me to wonder, especially with a lot of Black conservatives, are you writing for Black people or for white people? Because white people on the right want to see Black people beat up on the things that they don't like other Black people doing. So it becomes entertainment for both sides. Liberals love a Black person who's going to come and say what liberals want said. Conservatives love Black people who are going to come and say what Black people. So see what I'm saying? It turns into an intellectual Mandingo fight that we don't need. So if we were really just talking about Black people and what's best for us, we would take all of the entertainment value for the white left and white right off the table and just talk right up the middle about the success sequence, about success, about strategy and planning to us, for us, about us, by us, in rooms full of us, for our own purposes. Is that a fair critique? Do you think that's a fair critique of the way that the arguments are made?
I think it's a very fair critique, principally because it seems like neither side wants to acknowledge at least some validity of the other side's argument, right? So if I'm on the left and I'm talking about structural barriers, like you just described in walking around voting, or I just described around charter policy not allowing new schools to be opened in New York City, that's real. That's a structural barrier, right? But if I'm on this side and I'm looking at the non-marital birth rates, and again, this isn't just an issue in the Black community. The highest rate of growth of non-marital births is in the white community, and what the implications of that are huge on the next generation. We have to acknowledge that those likelihoods for those kids are probably not very good. So I'm trying to thread the needle in many ways, going down the middle that you're talking about, which is to acknowledge that both things can be true at the same time. There is agency and there's structural bias at the same time. What do we do about both of those things? What is the shared responsibility of Black people on us and the quote unquote white power structure? I've been having these on my own porch, these socially distanced discussions amongst Black fathers. And the way I set it up was, all right, guys, and I've titled them "It's Our Turn," and I'd love for folks all across the country to do their own version of "It's Our Turn." We basically just get Black fathers. So, and the whole idea is like, so there are no white people around. We're not airing our dirty laundry. You know, it's just us. It's justice, just us. What are we telling our own kids? What are we telling our own kids about the future that they have for themselves? Are we telling them they just got to lay down because the power structure is so overwhelming? Or are we telling them what they need to do to make sure that when they encounter the inevitability, they have a greater likelihood of success, not just surviving, but thriving? And it's been really interesting to have those discussions because I think those intimate conversations, honestly, that's what I want to start having in public and not just private, about what we need to teach the next generation that they have the power to actually achieve for their lives.
I mean, I think there's a fear of Black people, period, of getting involved in these conversations, just period. Because, I mean, listen, the majority of Black people are moderates who want to go to work every day and do their job and come home. Like, it kind of drives me crazy when we talk about.
We have a lot of people speaking on behalf of Black people right now who are not moderate. There are a lot of folks who are putting their voice in the mouths of average Black people that I'm not always sure represent our interests.
So I'll just say this. You know, I don't know what your network looks like, but across the country, there are millions of Black people who go to work every day, come home, feed their family, cash their paychecks, go to church. Maybe they don't go to church, whatever, watch football on Sundays, live what I consider to be kind of apolitical lifestyles and lives. And I think they're moderate. You know, they're not as liberal as people think, and they're probably a little bit more personally conservative than people think. And they're not as awfulized as people think. So when we talk about Black people, it always has this, let's run to the worst statistics. Let's run to the worst kind of viewpoint and all of that, which I think is problematic in itself, because those people that are coming to your house to have those discussions, I think, are plentiful, right? Like there's a there's a lot of those folks who would do that and want to do that. But I again wonder who the conversations are for, because let's just look at the George Floyd thing, right? Because I see conservatives and Black conservatives. Actually, I think let me change this, because in some ways I would be considered a Black conservative. But I think conservatives who happen to be Black are different than Black conservatives. There's a difference between those two things. So conservatives who happen to be Black see a lot of mileage in the BLM, the Al Sharptons, the kind of usual and typical whipping stations, because they make for good fodder, right? But in George Floyd's case, George Floyd is dying for 8 minutes in the middle of a street, and Black people can have a choice. They can say nothing and just say that's just the way life is, and I should go to college.
No. Okay, keep going.
Or they can say, no, you're not going to keep doing this without any repercussions. And if you need repercussions that you'll hear, because you won't hear us sending a letter or sending an email or having a press conference, because you stopped hearing that years ago. You never really heard that. But you will hear what Martin Luther King Jr. called the language of the unheard. You will hear. So I see agency in that.
Yep, it's a different kind of agency.
It's a different kind of agency. I see agency in saying, no, I don't have to lie down and take the fact that
absolutely
that you said 23 murders. This is another thing I want to correct for the record and for conservatives and for everyone. The 23 murders is different than the number of cases of excessive force. So conflating.
Totally.
Yeah, the numbers of excessive force is endemic. It's like it's a pandemic of ill treatment every day that creates hateful people in communities, because they're so sick of dealing with the pettiness of the police, an over militarized police department. Anyways, I'm just saying,
I agree with that.
All of that's agency to me.
No, expressing our voice to say that there has been a history of excessive force. So not just murders of unarmed Black people, but excessive force. Undoubtedly. And that's an example of how both things can be true at the same time. That there is excessive force in lots of police forces. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that every police officer wakes up every morning saying, how am I going to go shoot Black people? So both things can be true. And this is the nuance that we're losing in this current moment, where I think people have been forced to basically take positions on extremes of either side, that we can't acknowledge the other. And so, I'm on a journey to try and find a path for all of us, not necessarily down the middle, but a path that recognizes that these things are complex. That, there's nothing complex about what George Floyd, what that officer did to George Floyd. That officer needs to be prosecuted to the full extent of the law, but we can't paint an entire picture of the police force in one way, in the same way we can't treat all Black people in one way, right? There's nuance. And so,
well, wait a second, can we treat all BLM members the same way?
No. When I say BLM, I'm talking about capital B, capital L, capital M, the organization that actually has a policy statement. No, I'm not talking about people who actually believe that Black Lives Matter, small b, small l, small m. If you actually read the policy statement of the Black Lives Matter organization, they had a moratorium on charter schools. They
actually, that's the movement for Black Lives. Is that what you mean? Like the movement for Black Lives?
Whatever I've looked at the most official organization. I forget the formal title. It goes a little bit further than Black Lives Matter, but their official position was that they thought that charter schools shouldn't open. That the idea of a nuclear family should essentially be eliminated.
Ooh, I didn't see that, but okay. Really?
These are important things for us to read up on, right? And we should have a constructive dialogue. What is the role of the nuclear family in not just the Black community, but every community? Let's have that discussion. For all of these things, let's have the discussion. And so for me, dialogue is at the heart of how we are going to move forward as a people and a country, where we can recognize people who are on the opposite side of us, maybe even acknowledge that a part of their argument is true, right? Like do we have the moral courage to say that? like, yes, you're right. There is more. I didn't realize there was the level of police brutality. I didn't realize that. So now I'm an ally to help address those issues. Simultaneously, do most Black people know that for women 24 and under who are having children, 90% are born outside of marriage, and the likelihood of that child leading a life of poverty is dramatically increased? Let's have the moral courage to talk about both things and develop strategies to address both.
I'm really trying to rock with most of this. I so agree with the positive analysis of what it takes to win. I so agree that we do better to save our kids from nihilism, and that we do better to prepare them with skills. What can you do, right? That and I feel like that's part of our heritage. Like when I described to you what my grandfather did in life, and this was really, one of my grandfathers passed away when I was 2, but they were darn near the same person on both sides. They had multiple skill sets, multiple jobs. They had come through the Depression and other parts of time that were very tough and made something. They bought houses, and they had boats, and they fished, they hunted, they did all the stuff that people do when you've created your own life, right?
Yeah.
So I feel like they would agree with you 110% that you got to do what you got to do. You got to. Are
you not hearing enough me saying that the barriers are real? Is that what you're saying? You're grappling with, that you're not hearing?
I feel like the bumping one up against the other is unnecessary. So I feel like you could just take one whole part of that, like the critique of the wrongful speaking Black leaders and BLM and George Floyd and protests and riots and police officers aren't all bad. You could get all of the MAGA stuff out of the argument and just make the solid straight up. If we have strong schools and strong families and strong moral behavior and strong kind of like affinity for self, like and pride in what we do and pride in ownership, and we teach our kids the skills that they need, and that we take responsibility for our children, like all of this discussion can take place without having to bump it up against the usual whipping boys of the right.
But
right is fascinated with this argument. I think they love the argument that you and I will agree on. I think they love that argument, and they love to have it with each other because it so lets them off the hook. Because it so lets them off the hook for the rest.
Yeah, but that's the problem. So usually that conversation is had in a silo amongst people who are just nodding their heads and agreeing with each other. Right. Mm-hmm. My whole point is you have to acknowledge the reality that kids lead every day. I'm not run schools in the heart of the South Bronx. I've seen it every single day. So to be able to say agency, but then not talk about, well, how do you build agency in a community in which some police are being rogue and all the other structural barriers that we talk about, would be dishonest, right? Mm-hmm. That would be dishonest. Mm-hmm. And so if we actually want to advance the interests of our people, we need to have the moral courage to acknowledge both things at the same time. I don't think they buck up against each other. I think, and by the way, part of the reason I think we do have to have the conversation simultaneously is that there are policies being proposed to dismantle the structural barriers that we're speaking about. Mm-hmm. So, for example, I don't hear opening more charter schools as one of those policies, right? Mm-hmm. I hear more things like, let's abolish the police.
Mm-hmm. Like, defund the police.
Well, I've heard abolish, I've heard defund.
Yeah.
So I don't know what that means, especially in communities where, at least I know, like at our schools in the Bronx, we have good relationships with the police because they play a needed role for our community. And I think a lot of our families would say that simultaneously. So I think it is important to have the conversations about what are the structural interventions? Now that we have everyone's attention, do we want Aunt Jemima? I'm
wondering about that point. Why is Aunt Jemima important to this conversation? I see it sometimes pop up on Fox.
Okay, you know why?
And I think it's hilarious.
It is hilarious. Yeah. For some people, it's satisfying. Like I can check the box. Some corporate CEO saying, "Hey, man."
Let's
change the brand for Aunt Jemima.
Fascinating. What box are the right wing is the right wing checking when they spend so much oxygen on the fact that, can you believe that they want to take Aunt Jemima off? Okay, you and I can agree with progressives like to do easy things, right? The progressives like to do easy, simple things, right? But the maggots like to do that. So who on the other side, what box are you checking when you spend a lot of oxygen on, can you believe that the left want to take Aunt Jemima off the pancake box? I mean, like, listen, years ago,
it's all nonsense.
It used to be a joke that she got a perm at some point, right? I don't know if you remember this. Aunt Jemima used to have a head bandana on in the early days, and in the 80s she got a perm. So they took the bandana off of her in the 80s, and she got this nice Michelle Obama like hairstyle in the 80s, right? And this became a big
rationale for that.
What was that?
Why did they say they were making that change?
I think they wanted to take a slave off of. Well, first of all, let's not be too glib about it. There is a history of racist artist renditions of people of color that became powerful parts of the American imagination.
Agreed.
So the step and fetch it, the kind of minstrelly stuff or whatnot. So that was the rationale back then. Was a major corporation didn't want a picture of a slave, a happy slave on their box.
At the end of the day, do I think it's better if we live in a world where there aren't Aunt Jemimas sold as corporate brands? Yes. I'm not saying that it's completely
good,
vapid example.
Yeah.
But when that becomes the apex of the change, and again, when I see charter schools, tens of thousands of kids, Black kids who need better school options, and we're all sitting passively by, where that easy policy intervention, no one's even talking about, that to me means there's some people who are just trying to get past this moment, do some frivolous nonsense that insulates them, and then the next thing happens. And so what are the real substantive changes that are going to ensure that young Black people and kids of all races, frankly, really having a shot at the American dream? That's what I am really trying to focus on, and not lose the message of agency. Because what if all the faux aggressives get what they want, which is to get past this moment, and nothing has changed? What is it that young Black people are left with? Right? Another disappointment. So it's a shared responsibility. For
teaching kids explicitly that they have the power to determine what their life is going to be. You're saying that's a shared responsibility.
So two things, that they as individuals, as well as the mediating institutions around them, their families, school, faith community, their local community. Raj Chetty, the economist from Harvard, has done this incredible analysis with what determines upward mobility. And one of the biggest factors he found is that in local communities, the percent of father presence is a huge indicator. So it's both within the home and even more so in the neighborhood. If we know that, where are we talking about that?
Why do you think that happens? So if let's just say that fatherlessness and so-called broken families, which I think are way more nuanced than people who make these arguments give it credit for, but I'm going to stick with taking their arguments on face value that single moms recreate poverty, and that the so-called
not all. It's just
not all. It's the favorite thing to bring up whenever we start making any valid critique of the system itself. So let's get it off of the system and put it onto the family and onto the mom and onto the child, so that we can not talk about the structures that they're born into.
I'm not with that.
But let me ask you, let's be real about this. Why do you think there's fatherlessness? Why do you think, if we're going to make this a characteristic of Black people in a discussion about the Black family and Black women and children out of wedlock, why does it happen?
Good question. So first of all, it's not a characteristic of just the Black people. The largest growth in non-marital birth rates in the United States is white people. The non-marital birth rate has gone from like 2 or 3% in the white community to, I think, a little over 30%. And for women 24 and under, it's 61%. The white community is being devastated by the levels of fatherlessness. So the whole idea that it's stereotypical Black problem is not true at all. That unto itself is racist, right?
Mhm.
So why are fathers?
But you said the rate for Black, what conservatives usually bring up is the rate, not the aggregate. So the rate in the Black community is what? What's the rate
For
of
women 24 and under, it's
Yeah.
90% of babies that are born outside of marriage in the Black community. It's
Yeah.
70% of all Black women, right? So,
Yeah.
so the rate of growth in the Black community, just because it's been so high for so long, is actually relatively low just because it's so high.
Mhm.
But white people are catching up, right? That's
Mhm.
something we don't want to lead in, right? So why is that happening? It's happening for a number of reasons. One could argue mass incarceration is a part of the problem, right? That many Black men have been taken out of their family roles and are now in prison because of excessive, mandatory minimums. And so that's a structural law that we should be taking a look at. What the intentions were whenever, Bill Clinton and, like whenever that was first done, has it lived up to what it has now manifested itself in? That's a fair question, right? That is part of the explanation for why there's such high levels of fatherlessness. There are other reasons too. There are other reasons that are more cultural, that there's much less of a stigma around a young woman among all races of having a child outside of marriage, right? So these things are complex. There is no silver bullet, but for us to not acknowledge that young women having children outside of marriage doesn't have deep implications, negative implications for their life and that of their children, you're just not being honest. And if you run schools in the heart of the hood, you know it. It doesn't mean that those kids deserve.
You just made a big point that I don't want to get lost, right? Because what I think is the progressives and the maggots, everybody, the deplorables, people on all sides have to take their responsibility for their part and stop talking about the other side for 10 days. For 10 days, don't say anything about the other side's problems. Only acknowledge and say your own problems, your own contribution to the problem. Just for 10 days, and we'll see. We'll come back in 10 days and see how you all are different if you just flip the script. So you cannot say, if you're one of the single moms advocates, the beating the drum on the, single moms, women are just wrecking it all for Black people type of thing. If that's your go-to argument or whatnot, what I need you for 10 days to do is really take ownership over the responsibility of the government for putting millions of Black men in jail because there was a known problem that was obvious to everyone. 600 times the penalization of crack cocaine.
I just acknowledged it. Absolutely.
And the only difference between crack cocaine and powder cocaine was baking soda and who consumed it. Right. So by some weird stretch of the racial imagination in the United States, adding baking soda to cocaine was the biggest crime ever. Like just adding baking soda to powder. Nothing kills a community and families like over policing, over militarization, extended. What do you think happens when you get research and data that tells you that the average Black man gets a sentence that is years and years and years longer than the average white person for the same offense? What do you think that the family outcome is for that? Because we forget that incarcerated people have families. A lot of them.
I don't.
As Christians,
my schools were
full of them. And you and I are both Christians. So as Christians, I don't know why we haven't taken that issue and said, beyond single moms, beyond everything else, the way that we throw away people once we send them to jail and we take away all their rights afterwards, and we don't want them, we don't have an idea of making them good citizens there forward or becoming more educated or any of those things. We have a very retributive penal system rather than a supportive one, a rehabilitation oriented system. So that's my point in this. You just kind of hit it on the head for me. Yes, we need to be having a strong conversation about the disintegration of family and the importance of the family unit in the success of any community or society. And at the same time, the people who make that argument can't keep stepping away from the ways in which the system has broken up families.
Absolutely. So when you asked me earlier, we could just have the whole conversation, just focus on what young people can do, agency, all that. it would be dishonest if we didn't actually acknowledge that there is a structural force that is contributing to this.
Mm-hmm.
I don't understand why it is so hard for all of us to be able to have that nuanced, in some ways obvious conversation. But when we both go to our prospective tribes and we're just sort of circling within ourselves, we're not making progress. Or we create these performative actions where people just basically try to get past the moment. I mean, I'll end with a quick story. 30 years ago, when I was at Harvard Business School, right? I was a second year student. It was the time of the Rodney King riots, right? And similar kind of moment in which all you saw on television was Black people, the story of Black people. Black men are hunted. They're rogue police that are killing our men. And here I was at Harvard Business School with my other Black classmates, and we felt invisible. We literally felt invisible. And so several of my colleagues, we made a film, wrote and created a film called The Invisible Men. And we got Black men from Harvard graduate schools of education, business, law. And we created this film to basically provide advice to the 16-year-old Black kid called Daryl, an imaginary teenager living in forgotten USA, a fictitious city. I actually watched it again. I look a lot younger. But this idea that, and we talk about it even in the film, like there are structural barriers that we must acknowledge. We are being dishonest if we don't. But we have to remind our young people that even in the face of barriers, which we are fighting to dismantle, they have power. They have power. And if we don't impart that message to our young people, that families, faith organizations, schools, communities don't impart that message, then it is more likely that we'll have kids that feel powerless. And that's the last thing we want for our kids.
Well, I think that's a good place to wrap. I'm so fascinated by the nuances in the argument that I think you're doing like yeoman's work in trying to create some common ground on this issue, because I think like we're in a hyper partisan intellectual situation right now, and we have been for years, and it's not getting better. It's actually getting worse.
Yep.
You use the word tribes. The tribalism is like abundant. My biggest kind of contribution to want to say is like, I have a problem with all of it. Just to be really honest with you, as a person who just wants to be free and is just like looking to raise free children and live a free lifestyle myself, I have problems with all of these sides, these so-called sides, wanting to assert themselves into my life in any way, shape, or form, or preach to me in any way. But I feel like the Christian principle of the speck in the beam, always seeing the speck in your brother's eye and ignoring the beam in your own is causing us real problems, right? Wow, so the Bible says, oh, you were very good at seeing the speck in your brother's eye and ignoring the beam in your own.
Wow.
I do think we have to challenge all of our friends and family and allies to look for the beam. Look for the beam, because if you spend 90% of your time working on the speck and looking at the speck, you are part of the problem.
Wow.
You're part of the problem. And I want us all to find the common ground. You are uniquely suited, though, Ian. I just really feel like you have you're patient and you're kind, and the way that you approach these discussions and you approach this is the only way I think we're going to win, because you bring a level of dignity to it that is needed.
Well, thank you, Chris. I mean, productive dialogue is what we all have to engage in if we ultimately want our kids to succeed.
Well, I hope you're going to keep coming back. We're going to keep the conversation going, and we're going to make others see the light.
But here's the thing. I also need to see the light. We have to have intellectual humility to recognize I could be wrong, right? And so what can I learn as we all have these conversations? We got to solve problems for our kids. This isn't about us being right. It's us coming to the right answers for our kids.
Well, everyone watching, you've been able to see how you can be in touch with Ian. He is at Ian V, as in Victor, Rowe, Rowe, on Twitter. And it's been going across all day long. I think you should check out his piece. We linked it here in the comments at the Wall Street Journal. And then look out for more, because I hope to continue working with Ian and bringing about the critical conversations we need to have that I think help us advance, but do it together. So for all of you watching, all of the great comments, I appreciate you all. I've been watching a lot of them as they go by. I'm going to read them all after we get off the show here today, but I do so appreciate you watching. And this has, again, been a very, I think, a thought-provoking conversation. So thank you, Ian.
Chris, thank you, man. And thanks for everyone for listening. As I say all the time, we're in this together. Same aims, maybe different strategies, but let's talk about the strategies we want to advance our people.